Well, thank you to Lucas van der Velde and Ari Altena and so many others for putting together really a quite amazing conference in a place that I know well and love dearly. As Ari has also alluded to, I am from here. And also I wanted to say thanks for encouraging, nudging me, insisting that I speak to this title, the democracy test, on the invitation of Lucas and Ari. So here it goes. It is increasingly obvious that technologies that were designed to enable everyday forms of participation today serve other aims than those of democracy. Take smart monitoring devices, smart energy monitoring devices, like this detective. This platform supports the interpretation of energy habits by non-expert users. Now, some environmentalists have welcomed gadgets like these because they locate engagement with issues like climate change and fossil fuel dependency in mundane settings, in het gewone leven. Now, as such, these devices can serve as practical reminders that that addressing environmental issues does not just depend on technical solutions. They require changes in the very habits and material practices that constitute everyday life. However, environmental monitoring devices are today also criticized for undermining democracy. Among others, they provide channels for third-party services, commercial applications that run on top of smart meters, to steal our data and feed us advertising. And smart meters have been critically received by many, including a newspaper alluded to previously, the Daily Telegraph, who has referred to these devices as spies in the home. Now, technologies of participation may then not only support, but also threaten the role of citizens in society. And today, we have to take this diagnosis one step further. That digital devices raise moral, social, and political concerns is today welcomed by the technology industry. Far from considering such issues a liability, technology companies seem to view public scandal and outrage and public concern in quite positive terms as a way to attract attention and publicity. And this is where driverless cars come in, as far as I'm concerned. Because most of us have probably heard of the fatal car crash. And I'm returning here to themes of this morning, of car crashes. But in this instance, I'm thinking of the crash that occurred last spring in Florida and involved a Tesla car in autopilot mode, which mistook an oncoming truck for the sky and killed its driver while he was watching Harry Potter. Now, there have been many other such crashes, fatal and non-fatal, and there have been many minor kerfuffles involving computationally enhanced or intelligent cars in recent years. In July 2015, the Daily Mail, another UK newspaper, asked the rhetorical question, "Is your car safe?" reporting that hackers had taken control of a Jeep Cherokee and crashed it into a ditch by gaining access through the entertainment system. However, while such technological breaches of everyday life, such disruptions of everyday environments and everyday technology, highlight concerns with issues like data theft, data ownership, and in many ways I consider these chips on wheels as quite similar to smart electricity meters. So these cars raise many of the similar issues and concerns that smart energy monitoring devices also raised. But here these concerns seem to almost be purposefully elicited. Here the scandal of technology, if you want to put it that way, is staged in order to attract public attention. So later in that same article, the Daily Mail refers to the hackers that perpetrated this disruption as security experts, suggesting that it was quite a deliberate intervention. Now, participation seems to play a significant role in all of this. Much media reporting on street testing of computationally enhanced cars favors amateur footage. And here you see an example of this, a video from 2010 that shows two guys trying to get the collision avoidance software on their Volvo cars to work and failing to get it to work. Now, it's this kind of footage of everyday users filming themselves driving cars in autopilot mode that are referenced intensely in driverless cars reporting. And they place the issues raised in a quasi-comical context. Now, in this talk, I would like to query the changing relationships between digital innovation and digital participation and their implications for democracy. And I want to do this by sticking to the street trial, as this format, I think, makes usefully clear the precise ways in which democracy is today failed by digital innovation, or how digital innovation is today failing the democracy test. And then I'm going to conclude, if time permits, I hope it will, that addressing this failure will require imagination, or an imaginary, as we've learned from Helen Varren, and make the case for a creative approach to democracy testing. Okay, so step one, a beta testing approach to social issues. One way to interpret the recent proliferation of street trials involving computationally enhanced cars is as an instantiation of a wider approach to the introduction of technology to society. This approach has been called by Steve Jackson and others the beta testing approach to the introduction of technology to everyday life and society. In the tech industry, it has become customary to release experimental products to users at an early stage in their development. And companies increasingly rely on user practices and field tests to identify not only technical problems with the applications in question, but also the ethical, social, political, and legal problems with their functioning in society. Such an approach is intensely relaxed about introducing relatively untested, unstable technologies into everyday settings and the societal disruption that this may cause. Indeed, as Jackson and colleagues point out, this approach actively welcomes controversy. It welcomes expression of concern and expressions of outrage, insofar as this may be an effective way of organizing an audience for a new product or service. Now, there are many examples of this, including in the form of apps, which Jackson and all discuss extensively, in particular one called Girls Near Me, which caused outrage online, but then was quickly thereupon improved in terms of requiring more active consent from users. But I think driverless cars and driverless street trials are also an example of this beta testing approach to social issues. Because in the case of the Tesla autopilot and the crash that I already mentioned in Florida, the company did not seek to contain the controversy, but instead it took advantage of the attention generated to make loud statements about its self-professed willingness to listen and learn, announcing prompt changes in the application's design and functionality, in this case of autopilot. Now, what is striking about this approach is the active encouragement of user participation in the innovation process, in the form of test driving in the wild by users, while at the same time, this approach to technology testing displays and feeds indifference towards institutional procedures of democracy. So we have a combination of encouraging participation and undermining established procedures of public accountability. Indeed, Tesla and other industries active in this space make proud of the fact that they have not applied for regulatory approval for their tests. And so, indeed, do some governments. So in the city where I now work, Coventry, a range of driverless street trials have been planned, and these trials have been introduced, among others, in reference to a governmental approach to innovation, which is described as a non-regulatory approach. And this approach celebrates the uniqueness of the United Kingdom as the only country in the world in which it is legal to take your hands off the steering wheel while driving on public roads, meaning that there's no need to go through any formal approval process to test driverless cars. And here you see the minister visiting the, one of the test sites in Coventry in the West Midlands. Now, what does this all mean for democracy? First, it seems far more necessary today than it was before to state the obvious. Digital technology is failing and has failed the democracy test. Today's strategies of digital innovation are designed to circumvent and sidestep democratic process. This non-regulatory approach, to put it mildly, displays indifference to arrangements of public oversight over the introduction of technology to society. And it makes light of the idea of the public having a real, actual say on whether or not these things should be allowed on our streets. However, there's also another failure of democracy at work here. One that is much less obvious and more complicated. And it's the one that I would like to focus on now. Because the undermining of arrangements of public oversight and public accountability is not just a matter of policy, and it's not even a matter of bad intentions, but it may well derive from the very methodology of digital innovation that is pursued in projects like these. So there may well be a second crisis of democracy, and this I want to explore and analyze. And this one probably can't be adequately understood by relying on the normative idea of public oversight. So we need a different idea of democracy to detect that crisis. Okay. Now, to get into this crisis, I'm going to talk about another street trial. Because paradoxically, perhaps, street trials can also be used to make visible the crisis of accountability that, that I just mentioned. So I would like to show you an older test involving a computationally enhanced car. This one features a Volkswagen diesel car, which was at the origin of the scandal now known as Dieselgate. Now, one particular version of this trial was undertaken by two self-described curious individuals, Felix Domke and Daniel Lange, one of whom described himself as a former IT strategist for a large Bavarian company. And they presented the findings of their street trial in a public presentation at the Chaos Computer Club in Hamburg in December 2015. Now, their aim was to demonstrate the workings of the defeat device, the piece of cheating code that was revealed in the summer of 2014 to be running on the engine control boards, the ECUs, of an estimated 11 million Volkswagen cars. And here you see one of these ECUs. Now, the software running on these control boards is able to detect when the car in question is being driven under so-called test conditions by monitoring things like speed and the position of the steering wheel, in which case the ECU adjusts the car's performance, like reducing CO2 emissions and cancerous NOx emissions when it detects a laboratory setting. When artificial test conditions no longer apply, emissions will radically go up. Now, Domke and Lange undertook their street trial to reverse engineer the workings of this defeat device. So first they bought a ECU on eBay. To demonstrate its workings, they hooked this ECU up to Domke's car, and they ran the firmware already installed on it while driving around. First in Domke's neighborhood, I think in Frankfurt, and then on a dyno on a garage. And here you see the dyno up there. Now, monitoring the car emissions over time, the defeat device can be seen to kick into action. When test conditions apply, with slow and straight driving, the display shows reduced emissions, but when moving out of this mode, you can see emissions radically increase. Now, what I think the method that Domke and Lange used in their version of this defeat device exposure trial are very important. So the fact that they bought a cheap commercially available ECU, that they used Domke's own car, that they went to just the garage in their own neighborhood, all these features, I think, of the street trial are really critical to the point that it is making, or to one of the points it's making, which is that it is in our streets, in everyday settings, that Volkswagen diesel cars and defeat devices are wreaking havoc. Because I think this is a point that has long seemed theoretical. Carbon emissions have long, and also other types of emissions, has long seemed to be theoretical, just numbers stuff. However, their test also demonstrated a more complex political point about problems of accountability that arise from the design of intelligent software into cars. This software has the capacity to change the relations between the street and the laboratory, between the everyday environment in society and the test sites of research, innovation, and regulation. Software makes it possible to inscribe test conditions, the laboratory, into the car. The car knows when it is undergoing a test and was thus able to game it. And this in turn undermines the ability of governance to regulate automotive behavior in society. Once in the street, a car can change their behavior without telling us. They essentially operate beyond the control of empirical forms of governance, which are anchored in laboratory-based test regimes. Now, street trials are then not just instruments of industry-enforced anti-democratic programs of societal change. They can also be used as a critical method to bring to the surface a crisis of public accountability in technological societies. This crisis, however, is complicated. And we now arrive at a critical juncture in my talk, insofar as complex problems today are not exactly secure in their legitimacy. Indeed, I think it's fair to say, connecting to Erica's talk, I think that complexity today is being robbed of its legitimacy. It is increasing, complexity is today increasingly considered an unnecessary fiction, or by some even as an offense against democracy. Now, it is surely a spurious logic that posits that if a problem is too complex to be understood in 5 minutes, that one is then justified to ignore it. Like, this is a logic that we can point out the flaws in it. But the prevalence of this sentiment does mean that in thinking about today's complex crises of accountability in computationally intensive societies, that we have to think about a number of other things at the same time. We have to think about transformations in the relations between the street, the infrastructural environment in society, and the laboratory, the test sites of research and governance. We have to think about the complex shifts and the shifts in the relatedness between those two sites in our societies. But we also have to think about How on earth could we even formulate or articulate such a crisis in a context in which complexity is seen as an offense against democracy? Now, this is all surely a disturbing situation, but at the same time, the notion that complexity and democracy are at odds, so this notion that democracy and complexity don't go naturally together, may actually get us closer to grasping what's required. Classic ideals of democracy do not necessarily enable us to grasp today's crisis of accountability. These very ideals may need to be reinvented if we are to do democracy in the face of complexity. It means that we're facing today not just one failure of democracy, lack of oversight, and not just two failures of democracy, namely the crisis of public accountability in technological infrastructures, but also a third crisis of democracy, namely the failure of the democratic imagination. Why is it so difficult to imagine forms of participation that are adequate to complexity? The question to ask then is, what tests could we design that could expose this collective failure of the imaginary? We're okay? Sort of? We can, okay, good. So, by way of addressing that question, without, of course, quite being able to address it, I would like to show two examples. The first is an example that I've long admired. It's a video called My Friends All Drive Porsches by Helen Evans and Heiko, who also go by the name of Hehe, and I will garble their last names, as I just did. Theirs is a street trial that's in some ways similar to that of Domke and Lange, involving the ECU of the Volkswagen diesel car. In that Hehe's experiment deploys the street environment to surface a crisis of accountability. In the interest of time, let me summarize the problem of accountability surfaced by Hehe as big, large cars produce big, large fumes. And they, the cars, indeed do this without telling us, except that Hehe is telling us by driving a toy car in the streets of New York and using colored smoke and a miniature model to invert the scalar architecture of everyday life, so that what was invisible or taken for granted is made invisible and therefore can no longer be taken for granted, like exhaust fumes. And also, by making the big small and the small big, they disrupt or crack accepted assumptions and accepted assumptions of acceptability, what is acceptable behavior of cars, but also humans. Now, my colleague Nerea Cavillo and I also had a go at organizing a street trial, and this effort is still quite unfinished. But it focuses on the driverless street trials that are expected to take place in Coventry, the city in the West Midlands, where we have been mapping online debates about driverless cars in local media and also local social media. Now, in our exercise, we produce these maps not in order to represent the debates that are happening in Coventry around driverless, but rather to produce devices of elicitation, maps that can start a conversation about driverless. So we're taking our maps into the city of Coventry, and also we have taken our maps into the driver in the loop simulator at the University of Warwick, where current research on driverless is being conducted. Now, the story of this second street tile is for another time, but I wanted to show this one, and especially the first, to give examples of what I think of as experiments in interpretation, which are efforts and attempts to take the genre of the street trial and repurpose it in order to produce the street trial as a device for explicating problems in everyday settings. So where the street trial's capacity, I think, to explicate public problems, in especially accountability problems, is, it is realized. It's not that that capacity is not recognized, but it's not used. And I think the purpose to do the other kind of street trial is to take advantage of that capacity of street testing to elucidate these problems of accountability and other problems. Now, the question then is how to find ways to refuse the refusal of complex problems in everyday settings, to refuse the equation of everyday settings with those locations where complexity doesn't have a chance. Because as the facilitation of participation and the widening and deepening of crisis of accountability, as these two things go hand in hand today, what I think is required today is a democracy test that is almost like monomaniacally focused on the failures of our imagination. So the failure to perceive anything that we're not accustomed to. And I'll leave it at that.
If you move a bit over here, then Sebastian can set up for our next speaker, Jennifer Gabris. And he has a mic for you, and we can take... Can I give this to you? So if I understand everything correctly, the design of or making new experiments in interpretations is a way to create maybe a new imaginary for a democracy which maybe stands a democracy test in a technological society?
Well, I think, I saw connections with various talks. Is this mic working? Yeah, I saw connections with various other talks today, many of which I thought were really excellent, in that like one of the connections is that what I'm concerned with is that now that problems of democracy are so obviously proliferating, that we become tempted to revert to maybe more established concepts and understandings, like the notion of public oversight and regulatory oversight. On the one hand, I think that that is certainly not trivial, should be pursued. But the crises of democracy that are detectable in this area of technological innovation, I don't think that our understanding of those crises is very well served by an over-reliance on those classic understandings of what democracy is for. So, partly I just want to make the case for adventurous intervention as a mode of thinking, but I also want to contextualize that as what I think continues to be a very valuable trajectory, even in a context where it might seem that we should get serious now and stop playing around.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I think we'll skip the question from the audience for time's sake, because I'm afraid, Just one. Well, maybe one. After.
Look.
Okay, one question. I'll give you.
What difference, if any, do you see between what you're describing as a failure of imagination and what moral psychologists refer to as confirmation bias, the tendency to dismiss evidence which does not fit our previously imagined future or self?
Yeah. There is a part of this talk which I couldn't give because of time, but what I'm very interested in is the fact that it's already for pretty much a century that political and cultural and social theorists have been pointing out that our understandings of democracy are inadequate to an age of complexity. So, and this connects also to somewhat of Helen Verren's points, that notions of relatedness, entanglement over distance, that ideals of democracy that presume a bounded community are incapable of valorizing those forms of connection. And it's, personally, I find it like endlessly fascinating that already for 100 years, this point has been made and remade, and somehow the shifting of democratic imaginaries is proving an immensely, well, hard work. Now, why is that? There are many, many reasons, some good, some bad, but I do think that the points that also that Helen Verren earlier made about the imaginary, about the imaginary as the plane on which this relating to a public or performing a public also happens, that we've not been very good at appreciating that. So in that sense, I'm not so very much in a psychological frame, but much more in a political theoretical. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Good. Thanks for the question.